now, we have Jillian Curwin, who is based in the US. I forget what state or anything. But Jillian is a podcaster who does an amazing podcast, Always Looking Up, and has some great activists, and I would, really tell you to go and check it out. Perhaps when I send you like the finishing email afterwards, can add the link to it or anything, and any other links from like Steph, Alice, and all that. So yeah, Jillian, without further ado, do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you for the lovely introduction, Erin. I'm so happy to be here. Yes, it is quite early, but I keep weird hours, so this wasn't too bad for me. And yeah, so as Erin said, I am the host of the podcast called Always Looking Up. We are going into the fourth year. But the roots of that, the beginning of that for me goes way, way back to really being a little girl, finding herself often the only little person in the room and having to learn to advocate. Um, my parents are both of average height. My mom is, hi mom, if you're listening. And they were both from them. I learned how to be an advocate. It helped that they were both lawyers. So I think I definitely learned from the best how to argue and advocate for myself in spaces that are not and truly, but in most cases, never have been or have had to consider a little person entering, taking up space, and using the space. So through this self-advocacy over the years, I learned how to advocate for my community as well, and would do that in sort of little ways. I know in 2018, there was a law that was, I think, potentially being considered. I believe it was a state law. It was either a state or federal law, but I wrote an op-ed in my local newspaper talking about it. And then really the moment for me where I said I really want to enter the advocacy space and try to create some change in the world for me and also for my younger self and the next generation who growing up, would often quickly, would learn that this world is not designed for us as little people. Um, was in September 2019 work was featured as one of 15 forces for change on the cover of British Vogue for their September issue. For those in the fashion world, the September issue for any magazine is like the big issue. They are the size of books. Some often, most issues are now, I think, over 800 pages easily. Like it is just the fashion industry's biggest issue, and fashion has always been a lifelong passion of mine and also frustration because clothes are not designed for our bodies, and even to this day, they're still not. So seeing her on the cover, I was lucky enough that I was in Europe at the time for a family wedding, and so I was able to get a physical copy of it. I was determined one way or the other, but being in Europe allowed me to, I went from store to store until I found the magazine issue and reading more about Sinead and the work that she had done up until that point was just kind of this green light for me to say, okay, why not? Like what's stopping me? Um, let's kind of build a platform to have my voice be heard and try to make change for the little, even if it's only for, even in the grand scheme of things, seemingly insignificant. So in January of 2020, I launched my blog, Always Looking Up. The name came from, as a little person, we are often always looking up at the world around us, at the people around us. So that's where that name came from. And the initial focus of the blog was talking about fashion. So I would comment on Fashion Week collections, not necessarily critiquing the clothes, but talking about, do I think some of these looks could work on a little person's body? And kind of leading to, we can be seen in this industry. You just might have to make some alterations. Um, I would talk about that. I would talk about fashions I saw at award shows. I remember writing a post about being able to buy multiple pairs of jeans for the first time in what felt like years, because jeans have always and still are a struggle for me to find and to fit into. So things like that. And then when the COVID hit here in the US in March 2020 and the world shut down, I decided to take a little bit of a pivot with what I would write about, mainly because We weren't shopping anymore. There were no fashion shows. There was nothing to kind of critique. And so I expanded to what does it mean when I say the world is not necessarily designed for us, understanding that design is not limited to only fashion. And and part of that expansion, one thing I did was I started a series, and it was about like a year or so into it where I really figured it out, called Girl Talk, where I would interview friends, mainly in the little person community, about their lived experience. And they would be fantastic interviews, but then I would sit at home for a week or so and try to transcribe to the best of my ability but quickly I realized that something was being lost. And so I was thinking, what if I turned this into a podcast, especially because there really weren't at the time, to my knowledge, any little people in the podcasting space. So I reached out to my brother, who at the time was majoring in radio, television, and film, and had a lot more technical um, and to say, hey, I'm thinking of doing this. Would you be interested in editing? And if he didn't say, it's really, I do give him a lot of credit, because if he didn't say yes, I don't know if the podcast would exist as it is today, if it would exist at all, because I don't have that technical ability. And he was immediately on board. He said, let's do it. Let's try it. Let's see what happens. And so Always Looking Up the podcast started in May of 2021. And at the beginning, similar to the Girl Talk series, I started interviewing friends, just people that I knew in my community that were like in my circle. And the interviews at first were definitely a little, it was clear that I was still figuring it out. If you listen to the early episodes, it was clear that I was still trying to figure out what is the message, what is the voice of Always Looking Up, what conversations am I really trying to have. I tried to have a list of questions and try really hard to stick to it without necessarily veering off that course I set. And it took a while for me to kind of find my rhythm. And the one thing, though, that has remained consistent, still consistent to this day, is with a podcast, and I tell my guests beforehand, this is not my space. It is a space I built, but it's not necessarily for me. It's a space where I want other voices, whether they are other voices in the little person community, voices in the disability community, voices I've talked to, also allies as well, or those who are disability adjacent, is a space for their voices to be heard, for them to have their stories to be told by them. Because again, in the media space, particularly in the podcasting space, our voices are not given that platform. So I always say, and that was the one thing that I have been consistent with, like, this space is not for me. I might have built it, but it's truly not. It's for my guests. So over the years, as I kind of found my rhythm and kind of figured what I wanted to talk about, it was then, okay, once I kind of got anybody in my circle who was interested, who was willing to say, yes, absolutely, I'll talk to you, was who else can I talk to? And that's when I started harnessing the cold DM and kind of going out of my comfort zone. I think in large part of it, is just because being a little person, it is very easy, at least for me, to often feel like unseen in spaces, and it's very hard to kind of like make your presence, have your voice be heard, where in spaces where you often feel like that you are going to be easily overlooked, and it almost feels like you're interrupting, like, that might be the best word for it. So it was like starting a conversation I was not very good at. And so with the podcast, I quickly had to learn how to do it, and would start sending cold DMs to people in the disability community, people in the dwarfism community I looked up to. For me, one of the first big gets in the dwarfism community was Rebecca Coakley, who I've had on multiple times now. Rebecca is someone who I've looked up to for quite a while. She worked in the Obama administration, and she's now the program officer at the Ford Foundation, managing their disability rights portfolio here in the US. And like, I had known of her, I had heard of her, but had never really spoken to her. So reaching out to her to say, hi, would you be interested in having a conversation with me on my podcast, which was still when I had her on the first time, it was still in its first year. I know this, I judge by the cover art that I developed, and depending on what it looked like, tells me how old the podcast episode was. Um, and so when she said yes, I was like, okay, there's, I can continue reaching out and see what happens, and understanding that the worst thing that happens in this situation is nobody answers, or people simply say, no, not at this, apologies about that. No, not at this time. So after that, after speaking with Rebecca and after speaking with others, I remember it was approaching, I guess it would have been like about a year or so into it, where I reached out to Judy Heumann, who this would have been in celebration of the 45th anniversary of the 504 sit-ins, and getting to speak with her, who is, if you don't know, the mother of the disability rights movement. And I personally did not truly know or understand her story until the movie Crip Camp came out, which, for at least for me here in the United States, was, in on all honesty, like my education, my first like true education course about the disability rights movement. It's not something that's really, at least when I was a student, that was taught in the United States. It wasn't part of our history curriculum. So when Crip Camp came out, it was a big history lesson for me and for others that I've spoken with. Um, so getting to speak with her was truly an honor, and getting to hear her story. And that was, I think, with that interview, was for me a sign that, one, this is something that like I'm meant to be, like, this is a place for me. This is a platform that that is important, that is capable of doing the change that I want to see. Um, and that it kind of gave me that real validation of like, oh, I my voice matters. And I think as a little person, often at times it's really easy to feel like, at least for me, in my personal experience, it's kind of easy to feel like that your voice is being shouted down or overlooked, or that you're just not feeling seen. So speaking with Judy was kind of like a reminder, like, you're meant to be here, your voice matters, and what this is something important that I'm building and continuing to do. Um, and since then and moving forward, the podcast has really been a place for me to not just have people share their stories, but to really advocate. And I think the first instance, and this is something that I talked about in the book in my chapter, was when here in the US, the Dobbs decision, first when it was leaked and then when it officially came down. So if you're unfamiliar, the Dobbs decision was a Supreme Court decision that essentially overturned Roe v. Wade here in the United States, which protected a woman's right to an abortion. And when the decision when it came down, was first leaked. So before the Supreme Court had published it, it was leaked to the press. And it wasn't necessarily, there was some uncertainty of like, is this real? But it quickly, people were talking and were like, this is real. The Supreme Court is doing it. It's pulling back a civil right that for 50 years was protected under the 14th Amendment here in the United States. And so, as it truly felt like everyone in this country was grappling with this decision and what it would mean for women going forward, what it would mean for our women's bodies going forward. I reached out to Rebecca Coakley and another friend of mine, Becca Bailey, who is another incredible young advocate here in the US, who is also one of Rebecca Coakley's mentees, as we call ourselves. And so, would you be interested in coming on a podcast and talking about it with me? Because from my perspective of the conversation regarding women's reproductive health and disability, little people's bodies were not often talked about. So I wanted to use the platform that I built to have this conversation, knowing that it might not be happening in other spaces. So we pulled that episode together in about 48 hours from the time the decision came down. I think the episode came out within 48 hours, to which I give a lot of credit to Rebecca and Becca for being able to accommodate their schedules to hop on a call to record, and as well to my brother, who, when like I reached out to him to say like, can you do this? we'll give you a little bit more incentive. But like, this is important. I want this out now. And he was able to do it. And to this day, it is still one of the episodes that I'm most proud of, just because not just of the turnaround time, but the fact that we were able to really use this space. Because I think so often with podcasts, particularly ones that are more focused on storytelling, they're not necessarily, because of the timing and everything like that. I oftentimes feel like with my podcast, like it's hard to kind of stay current because you're only putting out an episode maybe once a week. And at least that's for me and my experience with doing it. And so in this situation, we were able to do it within 48 hours of the news dropping, was for me to say, like, oh, this space is not just used for storytelling, it's more for advocacy. It's more for having our voices heard on these issues, and for inserting ourselves into a conversation where it is very easy for us to be left out, or often that our voices are not going to be considered in the disability conversation or in the larger conversations as a whole that are happening. Um, and so I think for me, as I'm going into now looking back at that and also looking at past episodes and kind of seeing where the podcast is now, it's certainly grown beyond my wildest dreams and expectations when I started it. I've been able to have Erin on a few times to talk about dwarfism representation in the media. I've had my mom, who again is here, to talk about her experience as a parent of a little person. And for me, I love that it does. I think that at this point where I'm at, it does have that balance of storytelling and having disabled voices share their stories in space that so often we're not given the microphone to do so, but also to use it as a platform for advocacy. In my show notes, I include resources. Right now, there are resources to provide relief for those who are disabled impacted by the LA fires, which happened in January of this year. And more recently, as of yesterday, and my Patreon podcast, which is kind of a separate, um, in addition to that's fairly new for me, I now have resources to support the immigrant communities that are being impacted by what's happening here in the United States. And so it's been really incredible for me to use this space that I've built, that again, I always say it's like, it's not for me, but to be able to use it to so much more, and to have conversations with people that I never thought, that my younger self certainly never saw herself talking to, and knowing that it came from a simple, hi, this is me, this is what I've done. Are you interested in having a conversation? And kind of giving this space, and it's something that my younger self, and I think everything that I do as a content creator, as an advocate, in these spaces, is for my younger self who grew up never seeing herself represented in media, never seeing her stories being told in media, in the news, elsewhere, who never heard other voices sharing their stories in this way. So for me, it's the podcast is as a platform as much for the advocacy as it is for the stories, which I think as a little person, are really, I think especially with what's going on like now and the conversations, like it's really meaningful. And looking ahead, July is Disability Pride Month here. I have some exciting episodes planned and more on their way. And I'm just really excited. We're about to celebrate 200 episodes as of this recording. We're about 5 episodes away from that. And so it's been really, if you asked me in 2021 when I started this, did you think you'd be able to, would it have gotten this far? I would have said absolutely not. Like, I did not foresee this. And so to get to this point and to still feel like I'm also just getting started, it's been a really exciting journey thus far. And I'm looking forward to seeing where it takes me. So yeah.
Oh, thank you, Jillian. That was amazing. That was really good. And yeah, really important podcast, especially, and I'm guessing with everything that's going on in the US. So it's even more important to have that platform. And yeah, I can't believe 200, it's coming up to 200, so that'll be great. Thank you.